Hello everyone, it's Drake again, and you'll be pleased to know if you watched my last video, I am now on the other side of the illness I was acquiring when I made that one. So I was glad to see I was pardoned that I requested in my last video, so maybe less of a pardon for this one that I'll request, but maybe one nonetheless. Yeah, so as you can see, I have very thoughtfully placed some books I got today on this chair next to me. And before I get to talking about what books are on there, I did want to show off two bits of interior design I have behind me. So first of all, you'll see this long string of books here is a first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is called a New English Dictionary in that actual printing. It was led by James Murray, and I plan on making a pretty, I don't know, I wouldn't say in-depth, but maybe depending on your perspective. Anyway, an interesting video on the history and the outcome of a new English dictionary and all the different characters who were involved, who oddly enough, I happen to have just stumbled across, not realizing they were all so intimately connected with the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. But anyway, saving that for another video. And then also, say hi to our buddy, James Joyce right there. So I normally have him hanging in my classroom, but I have to take everything home during the summer so nothing gets pilfered or Jilford. So anyway, and yeah, so what's this video actually about? Well, I'm gonna get to some books I got today. And how did I get those books? Well, I traded in a bunch of books that I already had in my possession, but had decided I didn't need anymore. And I traded in, I didn't count exact numbers, but it's probably around 100 books that I managed to move along and get the handful of books I'm going to show you today. And that's going to be the focus of this video. Like, why do I have 100 books to get rid of? What led to that? Why have I been doing that for the last few years? And I think I've talked about it here and there, but I do think it might be somewhat interesting to people, especially to people who maybe have just started reading, or people who have been reading like me seriously for going on a decade now. And of course, your tastes change. It's very rare for someone to have the same interests for their entire life. I mean, that's not to say my interests have totally changed. Of course they haven't. But like a few things I've added into just the last few years of my interests, like really getting into linguistics, has been just so eye-opening to me. And I've really kind of gone down that path. But by going down that path, because you have a limited amount of time, in life and on earth, when you go down a certain path really heavily, you end up cutting off other paths. That's the only possibility, the only way to do it. So inevitably, by getting interested in linguistics, I don't know, a few years ago now, and continuing till today, I've cut off some other paths that I could have gone down. And then I just looked, and about 9 months ago, I uploaded a video about traditional Chinese literature, or classical Chinese literature. And that, again, has been another huge focus of my interest in the last year or so. And so again, that path, Chinese civilization, studies in Chinese civilization, cuts off other paths. And I fully recognize I'm someone with a lot of interests. And again, that's another thing that has positives and negatives. But one of the distinct negatives is that I end up with way more paths than I can reasonably indulge in an actual lifespan. And that's one of the things I'm kind of butting up against. And I think maybe now that, you know, I've been reading seriously for about 10 years, it is both like as bad as it's ever been, but also maybe I'm a little bit more, you know, thoughtful and mature than I've ever been, so I can actually deal with it before it becomes like a, you know, God forbid, like a hoarding thing or whatever. So anyway, that's a bit of a long preamble, but I guess something that we'll do is kind of a quick sketch of my reading history, because that would also be a quick sketch of the contents of my personal library. So when I first got into reading, I would just sit in the library and I would just pull books off the shelf. And most of the books that I ended up liking were, you know, called classics. I distinctly remember I enjoyed Les Miserables. I enjoyed Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I really enjoyed Edgar Allan Poe. I specifically did not enjoy Lolita by Nabokov. I got like 2 pages in and I just couldn't stand it. But on the other hand, I really loved Ulysses by James Joyce. Skipped a couple chapters, the first read, but just loved it. Loved how he wrote. And there was about a 6-month span where I could still read fantasy and sci-fi novels. And yeah, after about 6 months, I no longer could. I just couldn't read them. And I still can't, for whatever reason. Got about halfway through Dune, read some other stuff. Tolkien transcends the genre, so he's still readable for me, but yeah, never got into sci-fi and fantasy. That's why you won't see anything on my shelves related to that in any specific way. You know, I have Erewhon and, you know, Tolkien, but it's kind of different. Brave New World, still cool in my book. So that's like the very earliest, but then along with that interest in Joyce, a lot of the poets that I started to really love, like E. Cummings and T.S. Eliot and Cesar Vallejo and Hart Crane, they're all modernists. So I really went down a rabbit hole on modernism for maybe 2 to 3 years. That was almost all I read. I view Cormac McCarthy kind of as a high modernist or a late modernist, whatever you want to call it. So that was really my main reading, and that overlapped with me getting into college and starting to go to college and all that. And then when I was in college, I kind of transitioned a little bit while still reading a lot of modernism. The other like great love of mine around that time was the Elizabethan period, plus or minus 100 years. You know, maybe squeeze in Chaucer there, you know, minus 200. And plus about 100, including Milton. You know, you don't have to include Alexander Pope or Jonathan Swift or any of those, but as long as you can squeeze in Milton, then we're talking. That was my other main interest. So that includes, you know, Thomas Browne, Anatomy of Melancholy, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spencer, Spinoza, all these people. And I still love them so much. And so that balanced out my shelves a little bit, as far as I had a bunch of modernist stuff and, you know, kind of McCarthy and some more recent authors, last 50 years or so. And then I balanced out my personal literary library with a lot of Elizabethans and Milton and all that kind of stuff. And then and that probably lasted a few years, you know, not quite as strong as the modernists, but it was kind of more prolonged. I suppose maybe just because I was so busy with working and finishing school and all that and getting whatever I guess you call it, a career, I guess. So doing all that. And then I would say after that, I'd never really had, which would lead us to maybe 3 to 4 years ago, give or take. My interest gradually started shifting to what people call nonfiction. I've never really liked the distinction between fiction and nonfiction. I think it's artificial, especially artificial, but nonfiction. So like history, naturalist stuff, philosophy, not quite as much philosophy, but mainly history and naturalism, stuff related to the environment, stuff related to energy, all that kind of stuff. Linguistics is a big aspect of that too. And that's been about the last 3 to 4 years where I've started to notice, especially in the last year or so, a heavy shift away from what I normally would try to read. And I'm more or less thinking about this as new stuff, because I can easily go back, you know, I always do go back and read the modernists I love, or, you know, McCarthy, or pull up you know, some Frank Stanford poems, or the Elizabethans, pull out Paradise Lost and read it for a while, that kind of thing. And I kind of treat that as like, it's always going to be with me. But then when I think about, okay, I want to try to read new stuff too, I want to find new stuff that I really enjoy, what kind of new stuff do I go to? It's really becoming less and less fiction. And as with any well-stocked library, you end up with more books than you've read. And if you see behind my shoulder here, so I've redone all my books, and that's all books from the 1960s at the top, all the way down to behind this big ball of bubble wrap. That's the 2020s and around then. So my main goal, thinking about like, okay, recycling my library, because I'd realized I had gotten over 1,000 books, and I was really not pleased with that, because, you know, of course it's just an arbitrary number deep down, but I really do not want to be the sort of person that just has a bunch of extra books that I'm, you know, not interested in, or just have, you know, lugging around. I've had to move a lot in my life, so it's really high on my list of priorities to not have just a ton of stuff, you know, this kind of material consumerist accumulation. I want to avoid that, you know, as much as possible. And I do recognize too that if you delete books from my apartment, I live totally like a monk. But that's a big deletion because this is basically a book room, and then in the bedroom, tons of books, living room, tons of books. No books in the kitchen, so maybe there's some room to expand, but pretty much everywhere there's books. And I really don't want to have too many books where I can't move them easily. And it's getting to the point where I can't move them easily, you know, myself. And 1,000 is a nice number, nice round number to kind of play around with. So the last couple years, I've been really taking stock, and about every 3 to 6 months, maybe, I've been selling about 100 books. The first batch was really easy. I just went crazy for a while and had all sorts of random stuff, and that was pretty easy. That was maybe 2.5 years ago. And then, like I said, 3 to 6 months later, got another batch of about 100. That was a little harder. 3 to 6 months later, another batch of 100. That was harder. And then this last batch that I just brought to Kaboom Books in Houston, which is, if you're in Texas, awesome used bookstore. I talked to the owner, and he got to see Lenny Bruce live multiple times when he lived in California back in the mid-60s. And Lenny Bruce is one of my absolute favorite comedians. Maybe my favorite, maybe depends on the day you ask me. But, so that was really cool. He's an interesting guy. I could tell you more funny stories, but you have to go meet him to make your own funny stories. But yeah, and I've noticed like a pattern. Some of it was intentional, but some of it was kind of an intuitive pattern. So what have been the books I've been getting rid of most? In the end, the books I've been getting rid of most are contemporary books. And I really kind of categorize contemporary as post-World War II. So anything written in the last 70 years really is kind of contemporary in my mind. Theoretically, the author could still be alive. And that was where I noticed I had the most excess, and I was the least interested in the stuff, which told me I needed to, you know, get rid of those. Send them to people, give them to people who are interested in them, try to sell some, trade some in, whatever. And so that's what I did. Two batches ago, like not this one I just did, but the last one, it was a ton of contemporary books. Like it would have filled up way more than this shelf. And then this just last one was kind of miscellaneous, because I do have some, I call them my archive. Like I have some plastic boxes in my closet back here, and then just to the side of me, where I just kind of had books, because like I said, I had to move a lot. So I just kind of have books that I'm not interested in exactly at the moment, but they might have been books I was interested in years ago, or kind of more, you know, archival books, like a literary study of a book that I'm interested in, but I only refer to the literary study as like a reference work. So I have it on my side. I try to limit literary studies, but some of them are necessary for me. So anyway, that's what I had, and I restructured all of my bookshelves. That's why I was able to make that Geography of the Mind video, which I do plan on continuing. So anyway, that's where that is. Reorganized all my bookshelves. Now I have 7 fully stocked bookshelves and a closet, fully stocked closet, the dictionary I just found, for $75. I found the entire first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary for $75. I think the amount of pounds it is in weight is double what it cost me per dollar. It's like about 150 pounds, I think, of books. I'm hoping it doesn't break my closet, but we'll see. But anyway, so I've been getting rid of a lot of miscellaneous kind of nonfiction stuff I've had, and then a ton of contemporary books. So that really is a shift in my channel. I mean, maybe if you've been following my channel, maybe, you know, I don't blame you if you haven't at all, but I definitely have been shifting to a lot more of what's called like nonfiction, a lot more ecology, environmentalism, a lot of stuff about China, a little bit more ancient Rome than I have in the past, and yeah, just kind of stuff like that, some biographies. And I think it'll pretty much stay that way. I mean, of course, I do want to keep up with some of the better writing that's coming out, like The Maniac by Labatut was excellent. The 2 New McCarthys are just, you know, speechless about those. One book I just picked up, Gretel and the Great War by Adam Ehrlich Sachs. That one looks kind of a, you know, pretty neat book, a new, truly contemporary, just published a month ago. That one looks really neat. And so, yeah, still trying to keep up with things, but definitely not nearly as much as I was in the past. And I would say, you know, after about a decade of serious reading, it's about time to, you know, take stock and really think about what are my priorities for the rest of my life. I'm almost 30, which is the oldest I've ever been. And so really trying to think about, what do I want to spend the rest of my life reading? And I've kept a ton of my favorites. I still have, of course, a decent amount of stuff on my shelves that I haven't read or haven't read fully. And yeah, really narrowing down, what am I going to spend my life on? And one of those interests is Chinese stuff. And that's what this big stack is. Excuse me. So, yeah, traded in about 100 books. I got 7 for exact trade credit. So I definitely was the loser on that one, in a sense. Monetarily, I lost, but for my current interest in the rest of my life, I'm the winner there. At least that's how I'm looking at it. So this here is a 5-volume set of the Chinese classics, translated by James Legge. I've never heard his name said out loud, L-E-G-G-E. He was a professor of Chinese at Oxford for 20 years. I'm not sure exactly on the numbers, but he worked with Max Muller on the Sacred Texts of the East series that was put out in the mid to late 1800s. Max Muller was the expert on Sanskrit and you know, all the Indian subcontinent languages. And then James Legge was the expert on Chinese. And this here is a reprint by Hong Kong University Press of the 5 Chinese classics that he published through Oxford University Press in the late 1800s. And that is the Confucian Analects and related Confucian classics. We have the works of Mencius, who is a, you know, kind of a follower or in the Confucian tradition. Then we have the Shijing, I think is how you say it today. The romanization in Chinese is just totally effed. I mean, it's just unreal how confusing it is. But how James Legge put it, and he was spending his time in Hong Kong, so inevitably he was thinking and speaking in a kind of Cantonese, but he has it translated as the Shu King, or the Book of Historical Documents, which is translated as the Book of Documents almost always. I think Penguin has a translation called the Venerable Book, but I don't know if that's a full translation. But anyway, that's volume 3. Volume 4 is a book I already have. Oh no, I got that wrong, yeah. Because the Shijing is the book of poetry, which he translates as Shi King. So it's still that K sound that's kind of unusual. But the Shu King, I don't know. I don't know how that would look in a modern romanization. But the book of poetry, Arthur Waley has a newer translation of it. Arthur Waley, so the kind of the you know, English sinologists goes, James Legge, he was kind of the first one. He translated stuff. He knew like a revolutionary who ended up as top man in the Taiping Rebellion, which is just insane. And then he knew another guy who was a major translator, works from English into Chinese. So you have James Legge, then you have Arthur Waley. He's the guy who got, like, you know, T.S. Eliot and all these people into Chinese stuff back in the modernist period. So early 20th century. Then you have, I think really the next major one is David Hawkes. And he's known for translating the Dream of the Red Chamber, Story of the Stone, the 5-volume Penguin edition. Around that same time, you also have Burton Watson, who translated a lot of poets, but also like an abridged version of this book up here, that's So Chuan. And then you have 2 contemporary ones for us, John Minford, who was kind of a David Hawkes offshoot. And then you have David Hinton, who was an offshoot kind of Burton Watson, is kind of how I conceptualize it. Because they kind of publish kind of similar stuff. Similar kinds of translated works from the Chinese. And so that's been one of my interests lately, is just trying to keep up with all these sinologists, and they're all still totally important, and like you can just pick up any of their stuff. Like this stuff, even though it's translated, what, 130 years ago now, it's still just extremely valuable. And the really fascinating thing to me about these is they're all bilingual, and the Chinese is in traditional Chinese, because there was no simplified Chinese in the late 1800s. The Qing dynasty was still totally in charge, and people had talked about reforming it but didn't do anything with it. So that's a really important thing for me. And then last but not least, this book up here, and it's just like this transliteration is just, oh my God. The Chun Su with the So Chuan. And this is the Spring and Autumn Annals, and then a commentary on it. And University of Washington Press has a 3-volume, 2,500-page edition of it that was just put out a few years ago. And I was kind of wondering, like, well, wait a minute, how does this have the equivalent of 2,500 pages? But it's a pretty big book. Like, it's kind of deceptive, but it's a pretty big book. So that's what it looks like. And then, yeah, it's pretty thick there. I think this 5-volume set is 3,500 pages of classical Chinese stuff. So I am thrilled. You know, that's about all it takes to get me thrilled, is 3,500 pages of classical Chinese literature and history. But yeah, thrilled with that. I'm glad I switched out all the stuff I did and then picked that up. And then before this video gets too long, I will show you the other 2 books I got. So I also got volume 2 of the complete works of Robert Browning, as you see here, published by none other than Ohio University Press. And volume 2 has, so this whole set is 13 volumes. I don't plan to get all 13. But one of the books of Browning that I've been interested in for the longest time and just fascinated with is Sordello. And this has Strafford, which is a play of his that honestly I don't know much about. And then it has Sordello. And if you've read Dante or read it recently, you'll know that Sordello is a major figure in Dante's Divine Comedy. And that is ostensibly where Browning gets this character, but it's not quite a heroic, epic kind of thing, but it's yeah, kind of a narrative long poem about Sordello and his poetic growth. So just a totally fascinating poem. I know Ezra Pound thought it was really interesting and said that it was really underread, and it is totally underread. I don't think I've met a single person who's read any of it. So if you have read it, it'd be cool to talk about it. But yeah, so pleased with that, Robert Browning. And then last but not least, one of the books I showed in my recent Geography of the Mind, that first bookshelf, is A History of Rome by Theodore Mommsen, which in my edition is a little 5-volume set, which is all about the Roman Republic. So that goes up until, you know, Julius Caesar basically, and then Octavian into Augustus and all that. And Mommsen began to write a history of the empire. But I think the story goes, his manuscript burned up in a house fire, which I actually learned Mommsen was also a scholar of the, you know, like Old English and Old Germanic manuscripts, and some priceless manuscripts from 1,000 years ago burned up in that fire too. It's just crazy to think about that. But anyway, his manuscript burned up, but I think 100 years after, like he was alive in the late 1800s, I think in 1980, Alexander Demant discovered in a secondhand bookshop a full and detailed handwritten transcript of the lectures on the Roman Empire given by Mommsen between 1863 and 1886, written down by 2 of his students. So the transcript was put into a book, and then that book was put into English, and that's what I have here. So it's kind of Theodore Mommsen's notes for what he would have done in a full book on the history of Rome under the emperor. So I was pretty pleased with that. Also, Theodore Mommsen won the Nobel Prize in 1902, which you know, no one talks about Theodore Mommsen, which is kind of weird because he's a major figure in European intellectual history. Really, he influenced tons of people from that time. But excuse me. All right, well, I guess that's a sign to quit talking. So, Theodore Mommsen, A History of Rome Under the Emperors, Volume 2 of the complete works of Robert Browning, especially for Sordello, and then all of the most important classics of Chinese civilization is what I ended up trading for a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't care about quite as much. So, that'll be all for today, and plan on continuing showing my shelves reorganized, and I want to make a pretty in-depth video of the Oxford English Dictionary, which in this printing was called A New English Dictionary Based on Historical Principles. And you also have the founding of the Early English Text Society, Joseph Wright's Dialect Dictionary of English, English Dialect Dictionary, and some other cool stuff. So that's all to come if you're interested in that at all. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you got something out of it. And yeah, death is a gang boss.